Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the NRW. I'm your host, Rob Medina, and I thank you all very much for joining me here today because today I'm going to be reviewing the movie The Wolf of Wall Street. Now, this week marks the 10-year anniversary of this film's release because this movie came out back in December 25th, 2013. I never actually saw this movie in theaters. In fact, the first time I saw this film was about, I think it was maybe 3 to 4 years ago, if I recall correctly. And the reason why I ended up watching the film was because one of our good friends who works with my wife had told my wife that she had seen the film for the for the 15th or 17th time, somewhere around there, and had also told my wife that this is her favorite movie of all time. And she had recommended my wife to check out the film when she had learned that my wife had not seen the movie, and they weren't even sure if I had seen the film as well too. They assumed that I did, but when my wife had come home from work that day to tell me about Wolf of Wall Street, she had asked me, "Have you seen the movie?" I said no. She's like, "Well, we should watch it. Our friend recommends that we should check it out." So sure, of course, no, we'll get to that eventually. So I don't remember if we ended up watching it that same night, that same week, but we did end up watching it at night. And then after watching the film for the first time a couple years ago, I really do love this film. But what's also interesting for me too about this movie is that I do remember distinctly thinking at the time, after I saw the movie for the first time, that as much as I really did love this movie and really did enjoy this film, because believe me, this is a great movie, but there are certain things about this film that I remember distinctly thinking about what I connected with some of the previous Scorsese's work, because this is a Martin Scorsese directed film, like movies, for example, like Goodfellas, Casino, Taxi Driver. I would even go as far as saying like The Departed, and just to name a few, where whenever I watch those movies, there's something about the some connection that I have with those films, with the character story that we're following, that I really did appreciate a lot more in those films that I didn't necessarily get so much in this movie. And I'll go into the reasons as far as why I felt that way, because even after watching this film again for, I think this is my 4th or 5th time that I've seen the movie, and when I saw the movie again for the purposes of this review, I saw the exact same sentiments that I felt the first time I saw the film. But again, I'll get into that in more depth with my review here. But of course, I'll get into the plot synopsis here, and then I'll get into my positives, my negatives, and then my rating. In 1987, Jordan Belfort takes an entry-level job at a Wall Street brokerage firm. By the early 1990s, while still in his 20s, Belfort founded his own firm, Stratton Oakman. Together with his trusted lieutenant and merry band of brokers, Belfort makes a huge fortune by defrauding wealthy investors out of millions. However, while Belfort and his cronies partake in a hedonistic brew of sex, drugs, and thrills, the SEC and the FBI close in on his empire of excess. And that right there is the film in a nutshell. So now let's get into my positives. My first positive with this movie is the fact that this movie is a lot of fun, quite literally from start to finish. And what's interesting for me about this film is that one of the reasons why the film is so much fun is because Scorsese does a really good job in hiring the right actors for these respective parts in the films you see, in this film that you see. And one of them being Jonah Hill, who, in my opinion, is one of the best things about this movie. And that's adding on a lot of great things about the film that I really did enjoy. But with him specifically, that I'm going to focus on is the fact that a lot of people do know Jonah Hill from his previous work in comedy. We have movies like Superbad, Grandma's Boy, Accepted, just to name a few, where he is known for his roles in comedy. But to be able to take that form of comedic acting, if you will, into this movie, and then actually form a really interesting character at that along the way, where this movie deals with a lot of deception and a lot of like, what you see is what you get, but then what you see is what you don't get, if that makes any sense. But what's interesting about his character is that I think for a lot of people that watch the movie, one of the things that people will always refer to the most as one of the best things about the film is his character. So, and it certainly does. I would say that Jonah Hill does a really good job in using his comedic abilities in this film that works effectively, very well for the entire story. But what's also interesting too, and pointing out the fun factor, is that this movie deals with a lot of excessiveness, where you can see right away when Jordan Belfort gets into more or less the Wall Street business, where he sees right away the excessiveness these guys have, the excessive amount of cussing, the excessive amount of like sex, drugs, among other things as well too, and then how he then partakes in that and just takes it up to the next level based upon with what you see in this movie, and then everyone else surrounding him as well too, partaking that, especially when it comes to some guys who probably have never been exposed to that at all in their lives, and all of a sudden they have everything available for them. They're just overloading with the amount of drugs and sex and alcohol and money, among many other things as well too, that they've never had before. All of a sudden is right at their disposal, and you get to see that in this movie, where it's just taking on to a whole new level of like just craziness that I was actually quite surprised to see that in this movie, because when you look at him, like Scorsese's previous films, you know, there's always a certain, I'm not gonna say structure, but there's always a certain sensibility that he has with his movies when it comes to the character development with his stories. And he's a really good storyteller when it comes to character development. This film, on the other hand, although it does have all those factors in it, but what's interesting for me is that in terms of like the comedic aspect of it, that's actually the most surprising thing about this movie that I really took away from, especially upon the first viewing of this film a couple of years ago. And then upon watching the movie again for the purpose of this review, I still enjoyed a lot of the comedic aspects of this film that it still presents to this day that I still think holds up quite well for me. And I know there's a lot of controversy about the excessive use of the word fuck, among other things as well too, that occurred in this movie that can be viewed in with, you know, not such great regard, if that makes any sense. So, but despite all those issues that a lot of people point out about the film, I still walked away enjoying a great deal from what I saw in this movie that to me still holds up well to this day, at least from my perspective here. Now, the other thing about this movie too that I really did enjoy is that the cast of characters that you are introduced to this movie, and there's a wide variety of characters that you get introduced to this film. And it's interesting because a lot of the characters that you get to meet in this movie, although they're very integral to the overall narrative, some of those characters don't really have a major part in the film. Like you have some characters that are introduced to for the first time where they are joining Belfort's new company, and you get to see them and you have introductions on them within like a second, and then next thing you know, you're moving on to the next character introduction, I should say, where you get to learn a little bit more about them. So you have an idea as far as who these people are, but then as the story progresses on the way, their involvement are just more background. To some degree, some interactions here and there that are very integral for certain sequences that occur in the movie where you really get to feel their importance. But some other characters along the way, although they have some importance in terms of like where you really get to feel more or less their impact, but then after that, they're just kind of in the back burner in a lot of ways. But what's interesting about, the reason why I'm pointing that out here, why it's also interesting for me as well, is because even though you have characters of this sort that could be viewed as more like just wasted characters, not a single one of these characters, despite the way I described to some degree how certain characters are involved with the story, it may seem like they're just back burner characters, but in reality, they're really important to the overall narrative here, which I thought was really brilliant about this movie, because a lot of times you get introduced to characters where you'll see some guy that someone knows in the movie, the main character knows in the film, and they're there and they're just more like filler. But despite the fact that these characters could have been used that way, they were very integral for the overall purpose of the story that made sense for their involvement in the film, which is what I really did appreciate, especially upon watching the film again for the purposes of review, where I actually picked up on that a lot more, because even though you might have seen some characters earlier in the film, middle of the film, and there might be a great space between the time that you've seen the characters the last time around in the movie, when they do come back, their involvement with those particular sequences in the film are very integral for the overall narrative, especially when you watch the movie, you'll understand why, and hoping if you've never seen the film, you'll do so to check out and see what I mean by that. But another thing I also want to point out too with this film is that this is a 3-hour run film. Now, if you want to exclude the credits, it's just under 3 hours, but still, you have the time to build up the beginning of the story for Jordan Belfort, understanding his background and understanding his beginnings, and then where it all developed from there, and where all the excessiveness kind of just took its own course and became more or less like his part of his reputation, more of the legend of Jordan Belfort. But at the same time, you also get to see what made Jordan Belfort so good at his job, where when you see that when he first started in Wall Street, he was absolutely green. And then on the first day of him being an actual stockbroker, the market crashed down. It was like the worst one since the stock market crashed back in the 20s. So his very first day on the job, everything went to shit. And then seeing how he had to come back from that, where he ended up selling penny stocks, which is like the lowest form of like stocks that most people would never even consider buying. But he found a way to make a large amount of money by selling just pretty much worthless stock. But when he found out that he gets to take home 50% of what he is given as far as the stocks, more or less the transaction is concerned, that was a huge motivating factor. You could see it right in his eyes. And then from there, you could see the years and of skills that he had developed up to that point, use that effectively to the point where all the other guys in the office that he was working at were looking at him like, how did you pull this off? And then eventually, when they saw how much money he was making and wanted to start off his own business, a lot of them followed him without even hesitation, because they realized that if he can do this here, imagine what he can do on his own, but with me a part of that, more or less that whole business that he wants to take on here. So you have the real motivation as far as like why his skills were so good and why anyone would want to follow him in the first place. So you had the time to see that being developed in the beginning of the story, and as it progresses from there, more or less the downward spirals that occurred as a result of all the bad choices that everyone had been a part of here and they made, and then kind of just went all haywire from that point. So really interesting to get to see that early on in the film and how that gets developed, because there is a purpose for all that craziness, because it is effective and actually useful for the overall narrative here. Now, as far as Leonardo DiCaprio is concerned, I know that he was nominated for an Oscar for this movie. He's a great actor. I'm not denying that his role in this movie is not good. It's a very good role. It's a really fun role and a crazy one to see him at that, because this is probably the closest that we'll ever see to him in this kind of excessive form of comedy that you can see like he does just a flawless job at that. But one thing I will point out about his particular character in Jordan Belfort that he plays in this movie is that there is a certain balance that he does bring to the character that is very hard to do, in my opinion, when it comes to the excessiveness to this character. Because the one thing about Jordan Belfort in this movie, and I think Jordan Belfort in real life had also admitted as well too, is that he took advantage of a lot of more or less innocent people that have nothing to do with the scheme that he's trying to run here. But then somewhere along the way, there are slight moments of humanity where you really can see like where he's really just down and out, and despite all the massive deceitfulness that he has done towards everybody that has that he's come across with, as far as the clients and whatever else, you get to see that there, despite all that chaos that ensues there's a slight moment of humanity where you get to see bits of that. And then that's a good reminder, at least in my opinion, of like not just how good an actor Leonardo DiCaprio is, but just really allowing us as the audience member, at least from my perspective, to really connect with the character despite all the bad shit that he does. But there is a moment of man where you do get to see some vulnerability, where he does show some sort of regret, some sort of remorse and sympathy for what he has. What's the word I want to use? Yeah, remorse is the best way I could describe it. Where he really just see that what he has done is not the best thing he's ever done, and that therefore, he does feel really bad for what he has done for a split second, and then right back at it again. He goes right back to his old habits of just going back to the excess and never want to take responsibility, blaming someone else for the problems that occurred. And there's a lot of that throughout the movie. And in some cases, I know personally, I'd always get very annoyed with characters that do that. But for some reason in this film, I never actually felt that way at all about it. In fact, I kind of came from more of a neutral standpoint and understanding where the character's coming from. I don't agree with him at all, but I understood where the character was coming from, because you had the time to see what the character's going through all the goods and bads. And at the same time, despite the craziness that follows around him, I do appreciate those little slight moments of humanity where you get to see this character. So I think that's one of the things that one of the reasons why I really did enjoy the film, because despite the chaos that ensues, there is still a great level of grounded characters that you get to see throughout all that craziness that follows around them in this movie. One other thing I also will point out too, apart from the comedic aspect of it, there's also more or less the dramatic scenes as well too. But the thing about the dramatic scenes in this movie, they're far in between, believe it or not. But when they do occur, what's interesting is because I remember might have been the last time I saw the film before I saw this movie again for the purposes of review, was that I do remember at one point thinking like, is there any real dramatic moment for these characters to really showcase something else where they can, because it's a lot of like voiceovers and a lot of exposition, which is handled beautifully. That's one thing about Scorsese that he does very good at is exposition. He does it in a manner that it does very well for the narrative. But sometimes when you get a lot of these expositions here, you get told everything, but then everything just keeps moving quickly. And then I do remember the last time I saw the film prior to this viewing was that, were there any moments of real just dramatic beats where you can really see the moment of the character just kind of go through some hardships? And I mentioned before, you do, but they're all far in between. But the moments that do occur when you see where the character is just making a decision, and then you feel like that they were truly confident in what they were doing, and then all of a sudden you see a moment of vulnerability where like, holy shit, I fucked up, what do I do now? Those little moments for me were such integral parts of the film that I remember appreciating a great deal, because what then follows after the fact, I wouldn't say that I forgot they had some sort of remorse or regret, but then when the story progresses and all the excessiveness starts to ensue from there, then you go right back to a more subtle moment where the character's just sitting there and just wondering, what the fuck did I just do? How can I get myself out of this? Like, just that vulnerability, despite the fact they're coming from a very selfish standpoint. But I appreciated those little more or less nuanced moments where you get to see the character just being vulnerable, and those particular moments in the film I really believe stick out, that kind of balance out the craziness that ensues in this movie, that really does bring out a groundedness to the film. Because despite the fact that you see a lot of crazy stuff that occurs in this movie, a lot of people had wondered if any of the events that occur in the film were in fact true at all, and it turns out quite a good bit of what you see in the movie had actually occurred in the film, that occurred in the film did occur in real life, which I thought was quite interesting. There's a lot more to the stories that we have yet to hear about that was not in the movie, that was obviously, if I recall correctly, they were in the book that I just left out for a number of different reasons here. So the excesses, it seems like is far too unbelievable, but it turns out to be quite a bit of it is actually true. So I did appreciate the fact that the excessiveness was actually in reality for what actually did occur, and what you see in the film might seem unrealistic, but in fact was part of the true story. So I did appreciate that as well too. But one other thing I can point out here to kind of more or less close out my my positives here is that I will say that Margot Robbie is a character, as an actress, that everyone was introduced to because of this movie, and she really does a good job in showcasing her acting skills. And what's interesting too is that despite the fact that her character in the beginning, when you get to see her, she's quite, I mean, there's no doubt she's a beautiful woman, but what I really did appreciate about her character was the fact that there was a certain aura about her as well. Kind of like when I remember when you first saw Goodfellas, when I first saw Goodfellas, I should say, when you meet Karen Hill, when you first see her, there's something about her that you automatically gravitate to, that the characters are, like in this case, like Jordan and also Henry Hill, just are attracted to. And then as they get to know the character more and more, you see the reasons for why they are in love, are so infatuated, are in a lot of ways obsessed with these women. And then the way that these, in this case, how Margot Robbie portrays her character in this movie, makes a lot of sense why there's such an attraction to her, not just physically, but just also something in her as well too, that makes you realize that I can understand why this man obsesses over her. So in that case, despite the fact that some people can probably view her as more or less like an object for the male gaze, it's kind of a weird thing to say, but I do see that. But at the same time, I also see a lot more structure behind the character, a lot more depth behind the character, where you really get to see the fact that despite she has major issues with the choices that her husband makes in this movie, she still has some humanity, where you get to see how she's able to use her beauty as a way to be the barter to, if you want this is what's going to happen for you to get with what you want, especially with me. And she's very intelligent in using that in a way that is very effective. But then later on, she realizes that despite her offering that it doesn't go anywhere. So now she's left with an ultimatum of like, well, it's either, you stop this or we're done. And then she makes a decision that she's completely done with Jordan, and makes a decision to just completely walk away from him. And the effect that it has on him after the fact, and how he's abused. Well, there's a scene in the movie where he actually does hit her, but the way that it happens, I'm not gonna say I agree with him at all, because I don't, but I understood why he had done it, because you had the build up to get to that moment where it just started escalating from there. And then when it escalates, the reckless decisions he makes after the fact, involving his daughter crashing a car, and just the real reason why you can see she does not trust him at all, because he does stupid shit like this. And then you understand where she's coming from, because you had the time to see that build up to where everything just starts to fall apart right in front of your eyes, and especially in front of her eyes as well too. So her performance, in my opinion, does a really good job in establishing that. But again, you have to see everything from more of like a neutral standpoint, in my opinion, to really see where her perspective a lot better. Because when I did see the movie again for the purposes of review, I actually appreciate her character a lot more so than I did before in the previous reviews that I had of this film. So a lot of props to her. And Margot Robbie is really one of the greatest actors out there, and you when you watch her roles in various other films, you get to see like how good she really is. In fact, James Gunn pointed out, I think he had said that that Margot Robbie was his favorite actor that he's ever worked with, if I recall correctly, and understandably so, because when you watch this movie and you see all the other roles that she's had after the fact, she's an incredible actor altogether. So a lot of props to her as well too, and her notoriety as far as like her being sought out for her, not just for her skills, because obviously people know that she's very beautiful, but she is really good at the craft as far as acting is concerned, and it does showcase in this movie and the various other films, as I said before, after the fact as well too. So what else can I say in closing here to close out my positives here? Well, as far as my favorite Scorsese film, believe it or not, this movie is not really in my top 5 for favorite Martin Scorsese movies. it certainly isn't my top 10, but here's what I will point out about this movie is that this is actually, I think, the first and only time where I believe Martin Scorsese has made any attempt in the form of a comedy, because even though this movie can be viewed as a comedic film to some degree, it's still very much a grounded film despite all the chaos that occurs in this movie. But there's a great deal of balance when it comes to the dramatic beats, the excessiveness, and also the great deal of heart that does go into making this movie, because you definitely get to see that with everybody in this film, that they're putting in everything they've got in this movie. In fact, one thing I can point out too is with Jonah Hill, where he really wanted to be a part of this film, but because of his salary, they were like, well, we can't afford you, so we may not be able to have you be a part of the film. So he ended up taking like a huge pay cut, which I think was like the lowest rate that a SAG actor can earn, which is around 60 grand, I think it was. So just so he could be a part of the movie, so that way they can keep the budget down, because that movie was at $100 million to begin with here. So with his involvement with the movie, he was willing to take whatever was necessary to be a part of the song. That means taking a major pay cut, that he was all for that, because he really wanted to be a part of the storytelling. So you can tell he's very invested and want to be a part of the film, telling the story and doing the character justice that he portrays in this film. And it shows all the way through from everybody in this film, from Jordan Belfort, who else am I missing out here? Rob Reiner is in the movie too. Jon Favreau, just to name a few. There's just a number of actors I'm forgetting off the top of my head here, but everyone in this movie, from behind the scenes in front of the camera, they've all done a really good job in putting in their best effort, because it does show in the movie here for me. So for me, that's gonna be my positives. Now let's get into my negatives. What's interesting for me about the negatives in this movie is that, as much as I really did enjoy this movie, and believe me, I love this film. I really think this is a great Scorsese movie. But the one thing I do remember watching the film for the first time, and also watching the film again in preparation for this review, was that I remember distinctly thinking what some of the issues that I had with the film. A lot of it has to do with certain connections that I had with the characters when it comes to Jordan Belfort's wife, all the other characters that we get to meet in this movie. I'm going to use Goodfellas as an example to get my point across here. When you watch Goodfellas, right away you are, from the very beginning of the film, you are hooked to the story just because of the intro and what occurs moving forward from there. In a lot of ways, The Wolf of Wall Street has a similar formula to what we see in Goodfellas, where you get to see the beautiful side of being a gangster in Goodfellas, and then the consequences after the fact. And then in Wolf of Wall Street, you get to see the benefits of more or less being a stockbroker, someone in the Wall Street field, if you will, and then the bad choices these guys make and the effects after the fact. So it has a very similar formula in that regard. But the biggest difference for me, though, is the connections that I have with the characters. Like when you watch Goodfellas, you connect with Henry Hill right away. You get to see the abuse that he had gone through as a kid and why he wanted to be a gangster in the first place, and then having a little bit of humanity, where in one particular scene where Henry Hill as a kid saw a guy was like shot up to death, and then he wanted to help the man and give him a bunch of aprons to cover, to try to stop the bleeding. And then the other gangsters were like, you wasted a bunch of fucking aprons on this guy and you made a mess, we got to toughen you up. But he felt like, but he needed help. But yet I think I understand where he meant by that as well too. So you get to see a moment of a humanity in the character very early on, so that when the story progresses along the way, you still see that humanity in bits and pieces throughout the narrative. And I connect with the character right from the very beginning, because you had that opportunity to see that and then connect with him along the way as the story progresses from him, despite the fact he's making some shitty decisions. A lot of fun moments he goes to that you as an audience, at least for myself, get to experience with him. Whereas in The Wolf of Wall Street, although you get moments of where Jordan Belfort's like, hey, I just want to be there for my wife and support my family, for some reason, those particular moments in the film didn't hit it home for me as impactful as it did, let's say, for example, like with Goodfellas, where you have more or less a real humanistic moment with the characters, but then instantly the excessiveness that occurs in this film and the rash decisions that he makes and the impulsive decision he makes along this way too, which are very detrimental to his humanity, where when he's trying to screw people over and over again, it kind of takes away from my connection with the overall character. That's not to say that Leonardo DiCaprio was not good in the part. He's phenomenal in the part. He's really good, and his Oscar nomination was well deserved. But the problem that I had with the character is that the connection that I had with, in this case, with Henry Hill, was never the same as it was for me, like I did with Jordan, like I would have liked to have with Jordan Belfort in this film, because it seems like the excessiveness, although I did enjoy a great deal, kind of just took away from me the true connection that I could have had with the character, like I did with Henry Hill in Goodfellas. So as much as I did enjoy the movie, and it is a great film, that was the one major sticking point for me, where at the end of the day, when I saw the movie, I really didn't connect with the characters as much as I would have liked to, like I did with the characters in Goodfellas. Because even though when you saw Paulie getting ratted out by Henry Hill for all the stuff that they have done, there's a moment where Paul Sorvino is just like completely broken from what you had seen that he had gone through with Henry, offering Henry some money and saying, but we're done. And just seeing the heartbroken, he's heartbroken through all this here, and how Henry's just tearing up and saying, please help me, I thank you for giving me the money and whatever else. You have those really true character moments that stick out that I always remember. So that way, when Henry Hill says, Paulie did the following things here, and you see Paulie just being broken, pissed off by that, I felt for the guy, because in the movie, it made sense why I would feel that way about the character, because you have these moments where Henry Hill and Paulie are just conversing, getting, really connecting with one another, appreciating each other's support, friendship, and whatever else. And then when it all falls apart at the end of the movie, you fell for the guys. In this movie, I didn't have any of that at all whatsoever. So that's kind of my long way of explaining this here, as far as where my negatives come from with this movie. That's really the only major negative with the film that I had with the movie. But overall, despite the fact that I had that issue with the film is still phenomenal. So I still enjoyed it a great deal. But in terms of connections concerned, that's where I felt like was lacking for me the most. Although I did connect with the characters, but nowhere near as much as I did, for example, like in a movie like Goodfellas. So for me, that's gonna be into my negatives. Now let's get into my rating. You know what's interesting about this movie is that as much as I really did enjoy this movie, and I really love this film, believe me, I really, really do. One of the things about this movie that I do remember the first time I saw the film, and even the last time I saw the movie prior to this review, is that I remember distinctly thinking that I can't watch this movie for a while, because I can't remember what part of the film it was the first time I saw it, but I remember for this review, when I was watching the film again, like more than halfway through the film, I was like, I wouldn't say exhausted, but just like I felt, I wouldn't say burnt out, but I guess the best way I could describe it is like, I felt like, how could these guys do this to themselves? I was just blown away with the excesses that these guys had. Because in the movie, Jordan Belfort talks about a schedule that he had about what drugs to take, what time, what he had done to clean his system out while throwing up, among other things as well too. And just the various other things he was doing just so that he can prepare for a certain drug that he wanted to take at a certain part of the day, depending on his schedule. So he knew, okay, I have a meeting at this point, so I can take this drug so I can stay alert. And then when the meeting is done, I'll take this drug so I can kind of wean myself down a little bit, and then prepare for the next drug so I can take it at this time. So that way, when the high kicks in, I can take this other drug that can, it was just like, I remember being like blown away with it. Even to this day, even when I watched the film, I think this is like my fourth or fifth time watching the movie, I was still shocked to see that. And I remember like somewhere around the halfway point of the film, I was just like, this is so fucking much. How can these guys do that to themselves? So then when the movie had ended, as much as I enjoyed it, I remember feeling a bit overwhelmed. Now, I don't know if that was the intention for, in this case, for Scorsese to have the audience member feel like this is way too much. We got to slow things down a bit to have that effect on them. Because if it was the intention, it definitely worked on me. But it's one of those things where if I watch Goodfellas, I can watch the movie, if it's on TV, I'll watch it right where it's at and finish it all the way through. Watch it from the very beginning, finish it all the way through. And then after watching that film, if I go to someone else's house and they happen to be watching the movie, in a heartbeat, I would sit down and watch it again. I have no problems with watching the movie because that is a great movie. And so is this film and Wolf of Wall Street. But after watching the film, I always feel like I need to take some time away from the movie because it's just so excessive for me that it can be a little bit overwhelming at times, because it was just like nonstop. It was like for lack of a better term, a cocaine ride. And it's not something that I really want to keep experiencing, because even after watching the film, like I said before, I enjoyed it, but it was just too much for my own taste, if you will. So I still love the movie. I still think it's a great film, but this is one of those films I do need a break from for a while before I get back on it again to watch it from start to finish. So despite all that, for me, this movie is still a solid cheers. And those are my thoughts on the film. Now, if you have seen this movie, let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. And if you haven't done so already, make sure you guys subscribe to the NRW, hit the notification bell while you're down there as well. And also follow NRW on social media, on Instagram, New Release Wednesdays, on Facebook, Nerds Rule the World, and on Twitter at the NRW. You can follow me on my social media accounts. On Instagram, You're So Cool with Rob Medina. On Twitter, You're So Cool with WRM. And on Facebook, simply just Rob Medina. And I want to wish you all a happy New Year's. Hope you guys have a wonderful holiday season. Until next time, everybody, see you next year and cheers.